Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. My name is Simran Jeet Singh. I'm a professor at Union Seminary in Interreligious Histories. I worked at the Aspen Institute prior to this in the Religion and Society program, and I'm a trustee for the Sikh Foundation, and really grateful for them for enabling this conversation. They asked if I would host a conversation and what I would want it to be about, and I immediately thought of my friend Sukhman, who's been doing some amazing work in the human rights space with the organization Ensaaf. So maybe Sukhman, I could invite you in just to introduce yourself a little bit in terms of who you are and what you're up to.
Right. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. First, thank you so much to the Sikh Foundation and you, Simranjeet, for inviting us into this conversation. Last year marked Ensaaf's 20th year of operations. It was also the 30th anniversary of the disappearance of human rights defender Sukhvinder Singh Patti, and this year marks the 30th anniversary of the murder of human rights defender Jaswant Singh Kalra. And so this is, I believe, from our perspective, a very timely conversation, and very grateful to be giving this platform to highlight some of the work that Ensaaf's been doing. Um, Ensaaf, as many of you may know, means justice, and our core mission has been to investigate and document atrocity crimes committed by India. And if you'll allow me to kind of unpack the term atrocity crimes a little bit, it's an umbrella term kind of used in the field of international human rights law that captures the most serious international crimes, namely genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. In 2004, when Ensaaf was formed and launched, we released a pretty foundational report that kind of put us on the map. It was called 20 Years of Impunity, and it was about the genocidal violence unleashed by the Indian state and the Congress Party against Sikhs in Delhi and numerous other cities and states throughout India in November 1984. And that was the first report to apply the international law of genocide to the violence that was perpetrated against the Sikh population. Since then, we've been focusing largely on investigating and documenting torture, unlawful killings, and enforced disappearances perpetrated by India's security forces in Punjab and in some instances outside of Punjab. And we believe our documentation does establish that these crimes arise to crimes against humanity. And we are also presently assessing whether they could also be qualified as war crimes.
Hmm. Well, so maybe even before we start getting into some of the substance of your work, we can step back and just get to know your journey a little bit. What is it that brought you into this work, and how did you get started?
I was a kid in the 80s and 90s, and that was a period when uh, Punjab was experiencing intense repression, and it was in the wake of Operation Blue Star in 1984, June 1984, when the government of India had engaged in a military assault on Harmandir Sahib, in which hundreds, if not thousands, of people had been killed. And so, at that time, in that environment, here in the diaspora in the New York tri-state area where I grew up, these issues, these atrocities were being discussed in every household, in every gurdwara. And it is through these conversations and observations that I began to, gradually understand what was happening in Punjab. And I recall, attending, protests outside the Indian embassy here in New York. I recall phone calls that my parents would receive from relatives and friends about individuals who had been disappeared in Punjab. And I also remember, traveling to Punjab again as a young child and not fully understanding what was happening, but kind of this heightened kind of climate of fear. I remember checkpoints. I remember security officials kind of randomly, pulling out sick men and kind of harassing them and humiliating them. And so I think these were formative experiences for me, these conversations, these observations. And by the time I was in high school and college, I was kind of, uh, diving in much more deeply to understand what actually was happening in Punjab and beyond Punjab's borders.
Yeah, and so okay, so you're a child grew up in the 80s. I grew up in the 80s too. And I mean it's there's something interesting about being formed during that period because I also remember some activism from my parents, some concerns, some experiences in Punjab when I was there. But I was also really young and growing up in the States. And in some ways, you could look at our experience and say, well, why do you care about something that's happening across the world, especially at such a young age? What was it for you that made you feel connected to the abuses happening in Punjab? Was it sort of a connection to the place or to family, or was it, a sense of injustice that you wanted to address?
Well, I would say that I was certainly raised with Sikh values, and I received, I would say, um, kind of formal exposure to the teachings of the Gurus, Gurbani, Sikh history, through Gurdwaras, but also through Sikh camps, and of course through my parents. And it was, evident to me, that the ethos and ethics of truth and justice, permeated, um, Sikh teachings and Sikh history. And so applying, these frameworks to kind of what of observing didn't kind of take any type of, leap in that sense. And certainly I would say the most, piercing experiences were hearing from survivors of torture and people who had survived Blue Star. And these are not types of conversations or discussions that you're exposed to on a regular basis, at any age. And so, as a young kid and as a teenager, when you're forming your sense of identity, trying to make sense of the world, receiving information of that nature, I think, was certainly very formative for me. Um,
Yeah, and so in college, you said you started to explore this a little further. What did that look like? I mean, I imagine that your school, your university, even your law school probably um, didn't have many resources for understanding what was happening in Punjab, right? Like when I went to college and even grad school, I remember, I specialized in religion, and even when I went to some of the most resourced institutions in the world, they didn't have resources on Sikhi. So what did that look like for you um, to sort of find your way, but also maybe to imagine what a life like this could look like, or maybe you weren't even thinking about this at that age. Maybe there wasn't an imaginative possibility for you to do this kind of work. But yeah, tell us a little bit about your sort of college law school experience and your journey through that into this world.
Well, I would say my academic journey has always been challenging. I never, excelled as a student. I did, I think, recognize in high school that I was drawn to law school, and it could provide a framework through which to understand things like human rights violations and even international politics to that extent.
Mhm.
However, in the United States, in almost every instance, in order to go to law school, you have to kind of complete an undergraduate degree. And so that was actually a tough decision for me. Um, I actually entertained the idea of joining the Marines. And
Interesting.
so, yeah, and so I had, kind of a interview in a sense, on phone, and there was kind of university recruit, sorry, not university, high school recruiting. And I quickly became aware that in order to kind of at that time enroll in the Marines or the military, any branch, you would have to kind of cut your hair. And so that was a non-starter for me. And they kind of made an effort to persuade me that it was okay to cut my hair, but obviously, that was a fool's errand. And so I kind of accepted the fact that, I would have to go to undergrad if I then wanted to kind of go to law school. And so in undergrad, yeah, as you noted, there's very limited coursework, at least where I studied, which is the University of Buffalo, on Sikh studies. And there was some coursework on human rights, and so what limited courses there were in the anthropology and political science departments, I did take those. But ultimately, I was, in a sense, just biding my time to go to law school. In law school at American University, I would say I certainly found my academic community or my tribe, because American University is well regarded for international law and international human rights law. And so in that sense, I was able to curate a curriculum that really supported my desire to become an advocate for issues of human rights violations in India and in Punjab.
So would you say even in college, you were pretty clear that you wanted to get into international law, human rights law, or was that sort of something you had to figure out in some way? I mean, I guess for me, um, because I grew up in a world where there, academics was not really um, an aspiration. I mean, it was like, you go get your college degree and you move on and you get a job. And it's not like my parents really pushed me to do like the traditional doctor, engineer, lawyer kind of thing. Um, they encouraged me to think outside the box, but even outside the box, felt like my own imagination was limited. Like I could be a journalist, but I didn't really know what a career like the one I have now could look like because I'd never seen it. And so I'm wondering if when you were in college, was it pretty clear to you? Because your work has effectively been entrepreneurial, right? Like you've had to build your own organization and create, I mean, with a partner, of course, but like create a vision, get funding, all these things that require some level of entrepreneurship. And so is this what you had in mind when you were in, 18, 20, 22 years old?
No, absolutely not. I think I even have had a limited understanding of what it meant to go to law school and to, be a lawyer, what lawyering was. I would say I had some awareness of, the United Nations, growing up in a suburb of New York, having attended, these protests, having visited the UN. I had some general sense of like, okay, what is the United Nations,
Mm.
Universal Declaration of Human Rights, some of these international treaties like the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and kind of, I guess you could say, vague understandings of what is international advocacy, what are the international mechanisms that one might be able to appeal to kind of challenge India on its human rights record. However, in undergrad, it was like I said, I struggled in a sense because I didn't see the direct translation of the coursework that I was taking to my interest in law and human rights. And then once I was in law school, I think I was not thinking in terms of starting an organization. That probably didn't happen until my third year of law school. And so prior to that, it was really uh, thinking of lawyering, kind of the way someone might represent individuals in specific cases, or working for another NGO that represented individuals in a certain context. I would say it wasn't until my third year of law school when I and Jiskar Kaur, the co-founder of Ensaaf, organized a conference at Harvard Law School about impunity for gross human rights violations in India. And that conference involved bringing together academics and practitioners who were on the front lines of human rights issues in India. And it was through those conversations and presentations that we developed kind of a clearer understanding of one, how human rights work unfolds, what are the kind of root causes of some of these atrocities, and what could be a approach to redressing these. And so we, I think, took away three key insights, I would say. One is that, India has been perpetrating these abuses for decades, and within essentially an unlimited amount of resources, marshaling all their institutions, different branches of government, plus a blank check to quelling certain populations and committing these abuses, and then, fomenting a culture of impunity. And so the idea that there was going to be one case or one thing that you could do to redress, decades of human rights violations, was erroneous thinking. And so we quickly realized that, we would need to have an organized, concerted effort with an equal, commitment, obviously not in resources, but certainly in terms of time, that this was a long-term commitment. We also recognized that, by virtue of our privilege of being in the United States, we had access to resources that people in India did not. And so we also observed that one of the reasons why human rights movements and even individual specific uh, cases around disappearances or torture, unlawful killing in Punjab didn't progress as well as they could or outright failed, because the advocates and lawyers who are working on these cases were not supported.
Mhm.
And I would say, yeah, the last issue, the third issue, was that I would say we recognize that solidarity was very important. So both within India and globally. And so that kind of very much became, I think, part of the, framework that we realized we could perhaps structure in part to lend our efforts ultimately to addressing these issues of impunity for gross human rights violations.
Yeah. So okay, you're in law school at this point, right? What you're describing, this conference you brought together, and it sort of gave you a sense of a vision. And I mean, I guess I have a a question around why. Like what, again, someone could look at you and say, these issues that you're trying to address, they've happened in the past, right? Like so these are common responses I get when I talk to people about 1984, or the decades of disappearances, or the abuses, anti-Sikh abuses in Punjab, and so on. And they'll say, well, it's in the past, right? So like, what's the point? We should look forward. Some people will say things like, there's nothing you can do now. Like, it's not going to change the lives, like what happened happened. Um, and also, there are also all kinds of abuses happening in other places around the world all the time, including in the States, right? So there are issues of human rights violations in the country where you live. And also you're growing up in a period now where um, I mean, when you were in your 20s, where there are civil rights concerns for Sikhs, trying to ensure that, hate violence is down and abuses are down. And so basically what I'm trying to say is you have all these options, and it would have been so easy to not do this. And so why is it that this felt like the thing you wanted to spend time on, especially in response to those kinds of questions that people often raise?
I know you're absolutely right. We often get similar questions about the historicity of these abuses and how to view them in the present day context. I would say, as an American, I observed that there were a lot of, in comparison to India, there were a lot of civil society organizations, there were a lot of lawyers, there were a lot of professionals, there were a lot of communities who were working on fundamental civil rights issues and human rights issues um, that connected to the US, whether it was discrimination, or whether it was, for example, uh, what we now know amounted to was indefinite arbitrary detention in the context of the Iraq War, whether we're looking at Guantanamo Bay or abuses within Iraq itself. And there were, very, very powerful organizations who were already working, I think, on these very, very important issues, which still remain important. And so, from my perspective, I thought that I could add more value by addressing issues that had been longstanding, um, painful grievances of Sikhs, both within India and outside the context of India. And what I felt was that, even now, 1, 2 decades after the origins of these flashpoints, that the community was still asking the same questions. How many people were disappeared? How many people were killed? How many people were tortured? Why haven't the perpetrators been held accountable? And so these are questions that I kind of, in a sense, uh, gravitated towards because there was no good answers. Observing the work that was happening in the United States, and now I'm, in the context of law school, I was learning about human rights movements and especially justice initiatives throughout the world, whether it was the truth and justice kind of reconciliation process in South Africa, similar processes in El Salvador, Guatemala, like around the world, there had been, at that point, at least a dozen concerted efforts for accountability for atrocity crimes. Everything from, the international criminal tribunals with respect to Yugoslavia or Rwanda. We also had the advent of the International Criminal Court, and so, from my understanding and perspective, that the atrocities that happened in Punjab deserved no less investment from a perspective of these justice initiatives. So why is it that other contexts could achieve a measure of accountability and truth and justice, yet Punjab still felt like kind of square one? We were asking the most basic questions. And so I think for me, it was really about, in my limited time, and in life in general, where could I add value? And regarding the historical aspect, I would, if I may backtrack to my time in college and even high school, I early on got exposed uh, through kind of documentaries and some reading about the genocide of Native Americans in the United States. And I investigated that a little bit further in university. And I would say that was a total, complete genocide and erasure. And so certainly, Native Americans, First Nations people still exist, but those truly feel like erasures, and and those are lives that have been lost to history. And I didn't, and so I there was a desire to kind of address that, but in a sense, because that genocide and erasure was so complete, there was almost nothing to recover other than memory. And so I internally felt very alarmed that Punjab could rapidly evolve to that state. And in fact, this is a deliberate tactic of Indian institutions, is to delay, 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 and thereby deny justice and lead to kind of erasure of these individuals and prevent a record from forming. And I didn't feel Punjab was anywhere close to that point. Um, Tens of thousands of people who experienced and survived these atrocities are still with us. They have an ever-present right to truth, justice, and reparations. And if you look at the perspective of international law, which I was increasingly being immersed in law school, the crime of enforced disappearance is actually an ever-present, and from my perspective, a compounding crime. The abduction is the beginning of the disappearance. It is not the end of the disappearance. And so until the fate of that individual is resolved, until the true circumstances surrounding their disappearance, or even if we presume them to be killed, until that becomes known, that is an ongoing crime. And so in that sense, these can't, from the perspective of the law, these are not historical human rights violations or crimes. Similarly, there's so many torture survivors who continue to live with the trauma of their experience, physically debilitated, severe mental health issues, removed from their ability to kind of, perhaps participate in labor, in employment, through their own endeavors. And that, again, has a cascade effect where the livelihood of their families is often impacted. And so what I understood and observed was that these can't yet be regarded as historical crimes. It would be inaccurate to say the least.
Yeah, I'm trained as a historian, and one of the active conversations in our field, and I feel this even as I'm teaching this semester. Um, the one way of doing history is to try and remove yourself personally and emotionally from the story you're trying to tell, and just observe what's happening. And when we do that, and I think this is sort of our tendency in the West, especially, it becomes really easy to take a flashpoint moment, right? Say 1984 or say 9/11 or some tragedy, partition, and just point to that moment as like that happened and thank God it's over. And here's what we've learned from it, right? Like here are the things that have changed. And in the case of 1984, maybe we don't have things that have changed in the way we've wanted to, but there's at least this tendency that so many people I think in our community have of saying that thing happened in the past, right? Even these responses I get from people sometimes who say, "Why worry about it? It what happened happened. You can't change it." And I'm thinking about what you're describing in terms of like these torture survivors who say, actually, like that's not just the past, that's also my present. And you said earlier this thing about the privilege of being in the US and wanting to use the resources you have access to address those issues. And it strikes me that like the way we think about our community, our tradition, our history sometimes is very much removing ourselves from from being fully experiencing it. And so, what would it take for us, or what might change? Maybe how might we change if instead of saying something like the human rights abuses um, happened in the past, and instead we framed it as the human rights abuses that happened are continuing to have effects on people we care about, people in our community, right? And I wonder if you have any live examples. Are you in conversation with people who decades later are still actively working through these issues, maybe missing family members or grieving loss?
Thank you for that question. I have, two connections that I would like to make that I was alluding to, but I think it's, given your question, I think it's worth explicitly making these connections. Even if, let's say, for the sake of the argument, we wanted to consider the context of Punjab as historical atrocities. Um, there's clear evidence to show that impunity, the failure to hold the perpetrators of these atrocities accountable, leads to the replication of abuses. And this is a concept that is kind of understood, I would, very specifically within law, but I think generally society understands this, that when people go unpunished, for a specific crime, they are likely to commit that crime. Others are likely to recognize that there was no accountability for those crimes, and therefore, this culture of impunity is created, and they feel comfortable committing similar atrocities. And so, what we observed in Punjab specifically is that officers who committed atrocities in Punjab were then subsequently deputed to other uh, regions kind of controlled by India, specifically Kashmir. And then even prior to Punjab, officers that had committed atrocities in the northeastern states were then deputed into Punjab and replicated those abusive practices in Punjab. And and again, this is not unique to Punjab. You can observe this, throughout the world through many different periods of gross human rights violations. A specific example that comes to mind is when the French occupied Algeria, parts of North Africa, it was a brutal occupation. You know, torture, unlawful killings. I mean, the worst atrocities uh, imaginable. Um, and France would send officers, police officers, military officers to Algeria to suppress and persecute that population. Ultimately, these officers would return to, Paris, other parts of France, and what's been documented is that they introduced those same practices, these coercive, brutal um, practices among uh, the population of Paris. So kind of in routine investigations, they began incorporating torture. And so this idea that historical abuses have a beginning and an end, and there's no kind of afterlife to them, is not, supported, you know, in any sense, empirically, like through studying history, social science, through law. And regarding kind of specific Punjab contexts, yeah, there's so many instances where families have clearly communicated that they still want truth and justice. They still need rehabilitation services. I would say, like, one of my clear moments of obligation, the moment of obligation. I was interested in international human rights law. I knew I was going to work in this field, and it and I had I guess you could say, a head start in terms of my education um, around human rights violations that happened in Punjab. But it wasn't until I had just graduated law school and I was just cutting my teeth on investigation and documentation in Punjab where I remember the first case. And I often kind of discuss this case because it's emblematic for, I think, all families in Punjab who have um, lived and are living through these atrocities. And I remember it was a very rural village in Amritsar. It was a particularly poor village. And we went to the home of this woman, and she was living with her in laws. And what she shared with us was that her husband had been abducted by Punjab police and taken to the local police station and brutally tortured. She went there and begged them to release him. And what they told her was that they would release him after a few days of, interrogation. Hopefully, she went back there, and oh, the next time she went back, they denied ever having custody of the individuals. She then subsequently read in the newspaper that her husband had been killed in an armed shootout with security forces. She, of course, knew that this was impossible because she had witnessed her husband being abducted, and she had been told that he would be released from police custody. Yet the newspaper was reporting that he had been killed. So she, again, out of desperation, she went back and begged for her husband to be released. And again, they denied ever having custody of him and said that if you don't stop coming here, you're going to meet the same fate. And I'll never forget what she said. Um, you know, she said two things. She said, I live in two worlds, that of the living and that of the dead, because I don't know I don't know what to believe. And then she also said that I'm willing to kind of press my case forward. I'm willing to speak truth to power. However, um, I ask that you lend me support. You lend me your voice. You take my experiences and you tell the world. And so it was really kind of conversations like that that then over the subsequent, decade that repeated over and over again, families sharing their anguish of not knowing, wanting closure to perform, funeral rites, wanting to do simple things that we take for granted, like being able to inherit property. Because under the law of India, unless there is a death certificate, unless there's some definitive way to establish that someone has been killed, you can't transfer property through will or through other, mundane kind of inheritance uh, legal procedures. And there were equally alarming cases where people knew their loved one had been killed. And so it was not an instance of disappearance. These individuals had been tortured, their loved ones had been killed, and they would say that some days they're afraid to go to town, some days they're afraid to go to the city because the officers who committed these atrocities are still posted there, and sometimes we cross paths with them. Sometimes we hear them giving interviews on television. Sometimes their remarks are being reported in the newspapers, and this has kind of a devastating effect on us. And I would also, I think, share that these abuses had the most uh, impact naturally on the immediate family members and of course the individuals who were killed and disappeared, However, the entire village and communities would often be affected. These abuses were committed in a very, very public fashion, and the purpose was to actually suppress and instill fear on that population from espousing anything that the government found problematic. But there's so many cases, and to connect it to the United States and outside of India, this is something that we released last year, was a dossier on a infamous perpetrator from Punjab, Sumant Goyal. This individual was a senior police officer in Punjab at the rank of senior superintendent of police. He was posted in, different districts of Punjab, I believe, Ropar and Amritsar district. And throughout his career, he was promoted, ultimately reaching um, the position of the director of India's research and analysis wing. And so RAW, it's known as RAW. This is the equivalent of India's CIA. RAW is one of the agencies that was the architect of India's transnational repression and global assassination program. And a few years ago, Hardeep Singh Nijjar was assassinated by individuals working at the behest of RAW and Indian intelligence in Surrey, Canada. Additionally, there was an attempted assassination, a plot of Mr. Panoon here in New York, again, orchestrated by RAW and other intelligence agencies. And so there's a direct connection between the failure to hold individuals, specifically Sumant Goyal, accountable, him being promoted in effect for willing to commit these atrocities, and now leading the most powerful intelligence agencies in India, and then exporting their violence internationally. And so again, this kind of underscores the connection between abuses that are often thought of as historical, but in fact have a very, very long tail and continue to lead to the recurrence of these types of atrocities.
Yeah, I appreciate you making that connection because there was a question in the Q&A about if you view the recent trend of transnational repression as a continuation of the crimes committed against Sikhs in the 1980s and 1990s. So I think that's a really illustrative example of the relationship between the two, particularly through your point you were making earlier about accountability and why this matters. I think the very simple version of saying that, which is something a lot of us repeat, is if you don't learn from your mistakes, you'll make them again, right? History will repeat itself, and I think that's a simplified version of what you're talking about here, which is if you don't close the cycle of impunity with accountability, the people who have benefited from their crimes will only do more. And I think it's intuitive, and now we have some real live data around that and the significance of it. I wonder if, as I'm listening to you, um, I'm reflecting on other aspects of Sikh history in which we have also been persecuted, right? Like the Kalugare comes to mind immediately. And the nature of your work, um, as I'm listening to you talk, it sounds to me like seva. And I'm wondering if you have some, you talked a little bit about your upbringing within Sikh communities and learning about Sikhi and, different teachings. And I'm wondering if you have some core principles, right? You've talked about Ensaaf, like justice, and you've talked about accountability. Um, I wonder if there are other, Sakhis from our tradition that you hold dear, if there's any, examples from the lives of the gurus, if there's Bani. I'm just thinking about, for me, this point around accountability, Babur Bani. So Babur comes in from Central Asia and he's massacring people and, eventually starting the Mughal Empire. And Guru Nanak has this line that I love. He says, "Je sakta sakte ko mare taman ros na hoi, sakta si hu mare pe vage khasme sa pursai." And so what he's saying is like if equals like if someone sakta, someone capable, someone powerful, a capable person strikes someone who's equally capable, then it's not that big of a deal. I don't feel terrible about it. There's no grief, right? Like I'm not grieving that because that's not an atrocity. But if a tiger, a powerful, a lion attacks a flock of sheep and kills them, then the master, right, the person who is responsible has to answer for it. And so there's this really interesting connection that I'm drawing here from what you're describing in terms of, Guru Nanak Sahib and his Bani and the philosophy and like what we're called to do in this world. And your work is sort of living into that. And I'm wondering if there are other sources of inspiration you have from history or Bani or, Sakhis or anything like that.
Oh, well, thank you from sharing Guru Nanak's Bani. I would say that is um, it's very powerful Bani, and that certainly is one of the sources of inspiration, and I would say guidance. And there's so much wisdom in there. And if I could unpack that a little bit, first I would say it's an example of speaking truth to power. Secondly, I would say it's an example of solidarity. Guru Nanak is speaking on behalf of uh, the most like in many wars, almost in every war, it's often the most disenfranchised, those that have the least power, who are the ones that are massacred. You could study even conflicts today that absolutely soldiers are killed, but it's often individuals like children, the elderly, the disabled, who are disproportionately wiped out in a sense because they have no capacity to either flee conflicts or to defend themselves. And so you have here Guru Nanak speaking truth to power and showing solidarity with individuals who are essentially saying who are not equals to Babur and his force. And I think also something that, from the perspective of international law, that is illustrated as a concept here is the concept of proportionality. So, the law of war, humanitarian law, one of the pillars is this concept of proportionality. And so, when you're assessing whether or not something is a war crime, one of the things you're looking at is like, okay, was this attack proportionate to kind of the what that military target or uh, and represented? And so here again you have Guru Nanak in Gurbani illustrating that concept of proportionality, which is it's a fundamental pillar of international law. And this is often when we say someone is guilty of war crimes or is committing war crimes, this is often one of the core arguments that is made, is that this is was not a proportionate attack, and relatedly that this was not a legitimate war target. So if you're killing civilians, if you're bombing hospitals, if you're bombing schools, if you're bombing sanitation departments, and infrastructure that's essential to sustaining a civilian population, this is kind of per se um, a unlawful target. So I think, yeah, Gurbani, uh, uh, Guru Nanak's Bani in particular, illustrated that. And of course, I would say, the Shahidi of Guru Tegh Bahadur. This is an individual who was martyred for the right to have freedom of conscience, the right to have freedom of worship, the right to have freedom of opinion. And again, these are the most fundamental um, pillars of human existence and human society. It's enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This is enshrined in US law, whether we're talking about state, federal, constitution, civil rights, civil liberties. The idea of the freedom of worship, freedom of expression, is something that is so fundamental to the human existence, perhaps the most fundamental right, you could say, after the right to life. So Gurbani, I think, has always, and the lives of the gurus and their contemporaries have always been um, very, very unequivocally clear on what these fundamental tenets that ought to govern human society and relations are. And I remember I, began by highlighting that this year marks the 30th anniversary of Jaswant Singh Kalra's murder, and he is kind of a more uh, modern day martyr, compared to Guru Tegh Bahadur's Shahidi. And I remember in his last international speech, which is widely available on YouTube, it's on our website. I would encourage everybody to watch that. Something that he says very explicitly is that the Khalsa was inaugurated to defend the human rights of the world. And this is something that always resonated with me very deeply. It's something that is part of the Ensaaf ethos. And again, I think this is not something novel that Jaswant Singh Khalda articulated. In Sikh Ardas, we always invoke Sarbat da Pala, the well-being of all. And so part of the Sikh identity, part of Sikh practice, part of the Sikh ethos is to wish for the well-being. And again, this is just not a wish. Sikhi always requires action. And so again, I think this, human rights, speaking truth to power, defending human rights, defending freedom of expression is a very, very clear mandate that's, amply illustrated by the sacrifices of the gurus and by the words of the guru.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. My training, my specialty, what I really study and write about is Guru Nanak Sahib, and taking what I think a lot of us in the Sikh community recognize as like the foundational teachings, right? We talk about something like Sarbat da Pala, and then we source it in something like Ikonkar, right? The oneness of everyone, and then we
The
sort of
oneness.
relate that out to say, okay, well, what does that mean if we're thinking about us as one human family and our responsibility to one another, and all those things. And so that I think a lot of us, at least in this conversation, have understood and can appreciate. One thing is, as I'm listening to you, and I hadn't thought about it in this way, but I'm thinking about the effects of impunity, and for people who are living in a society where perpetrators are not held accountable but are actually rewarded. Um, the kind of anxiety and fear that must induce. And so, as you're talking about Guru Tegh Bahadur Sahib, I'm thinking about what he says about in Sulok Malanova, Pekahu ko detne nahepe manatan ko honanik sundaremna gyanita he bakhan. So he's saying like the really wise person, like who is the model for us? Like what is our responsibility in this world? And that is to not be fearful, but also to make sure that we are not giving fear to others. We are not inciting fear. We're not perpetuating fear. And so it strikes me that this is another way of thinking about the role of the human rights defender, of responding to, I think, a context, a country, but also a world right now where fear is really rampant, and people don't know what might happen to them, whether that's in Punjab today or if that's in, the streets of the US tomorrow, and so yeah, it does feel like that's a really important part of the conversation. Let me just I could talk to you all day and ask you all these questions. I also want to give a chance to other folks, and we've addressed some of them as we've gone along, but if anybody who's here live wants to drop a question in the Q&A, please feel free. Um, there's a question here that's more, I guess we could call technical in terms of why are things happening the way they are, um, and that is India has a huge number of documented cases of disappearances across the country and has been able to evade accountability of cases of extrajudicial killings and enforced disappearances. What are the reasons that the Indian state has been able to largely evade international accountability, unlike a country like Sri Lanka, Nepal, or even Pakistan, which have come under international gaze or pressure to address some of these state crimes, um, or the least initiate transitional justice commission? So what is your view on what makes India distinctive in a way that allows it to escape any kind of accountability here?
The reality is that superpowers and regional powers are um, rarely held accountable. That's precisely by virtue of their power. India is not an insignificant country. It is, in fact, kind of a regional power, and it has a very significant degree of, you could say, influence within international, institutions like the United Nations, which is kind of one of the forums where countries' records are impugned. And it's not necessarily India uh, intimidating other countries, but by virtue of its size, it can kind of commit resources to things like international diplomacy, internal horse trading, and just maintain a level of activity that is difficult to kind of respond to. If you're a civil society actor, if you're a small NGO, if you're an individual, you're really kind of trying to confront a Goliath. Relatedly, um, other countries are reluctant to hold India accountable because of geopolitics or because of economic considerations. So, for example, the U.S. has huge interests in trade with India. India is, after China, might be the largest market in that sense in the world, and so everybody wants to do business in India. And one of the key functions of any country is to get access to markets and trade, and so they are reluctant to kind of confront countries where they have an economic interest, and so that is the reality. That being said, I would say that that there is still huge scope for accountability within India. Without a doubt, there's a lack of political will. Without a doubt, there's systemic impunity, not just a culture of impunity. There's systemic impunity. So, meaning there are laws that shield perpetrators from power. There are laws that make access to justice difficult. That being said, I think there is creative lawyering that ought to be done. There is documentation that has been done, and more needs to be done that needs to be leveraged. And part of Ensaaf's approach is to present overwhelming evidence. So, despite systemic impunity, that these abuses will become impossible to deny. And so, I think in any context in which gross human rights violations have happened, the struggle for justice is difficult and it's decades long. And unless you have that perspective and a strategy to address those realities and are prepared for that, you're unlikely to kind of progress on these issues of truth and justice and reparations. But we wouldn't be doing this work if we didn't think we could make progress on these core things.
Yeah, well, thinking a little bit about going forward, we have a pair of questions, and I'll offer them to you together, that are looking forward in terms of what are you doing and what do you think needs to be done. The first is Sukhman saying, thank you for your dedication and amazing work over the decades. What do you see Ensaaf doing in the next 5 to 10 years, and how can we support its work better? So maybe you take this question and we'll move into the other question after that.
Well, thank you for that question. One of our largest projects was to visit each of Punjab's 12,000 plus villages, and then also urban areas, towns and cities. And we try to document as many cases of enforced disappearances and unlawful killings as possible. So we've published those cases on an interactive data visualization site. I would encourage everyone to visit that, data.ensaaf.org. During that process, we collected we recorded about 10,000 pages of interview notes in Punjabi. These are handwritten notes. And so one of our largest projects is we're in the process of typing, digitizing, and translating these notes. And so it's going to be a very, very significant new release of data. We're trying to rapidly conclude this project, around this time by next year. And it is going to provide us deeper insights into kind of the scale and scope of the atrocities. Connected to this documentation effort was we also recorded over 150 video interviews with victims and survivors of these gross human rights violations. So we're also making a full court press, so to speak, to transcribe, subtitle, edit, and release these videos. Again, we've released a portion of this collection, about 21 videos, on our Testimonies of Truth site, and so I'd encourage everybody to watch that. But these are going to be incredibly powerful firsthand accounts of people who experience these abuses. And what we're doing, through our documentation, through these video testimonials, is we're creating a permanent and undeniable record to prove that India's crimes, at a minimum, arise to crimes against humanity. And this is all part of the strategy to prevent overwhelming evidence for accountability. So that's kind of what I would say the next 12 months has in store. And we, again, are going to be working with all this data and documentation to engage in a legal and factual analysis to understand exactly what arguments can we make and what forms of accountability can we pursue.
That's great. Yeah, thank you. And there's another question that maybe is um, thinking about what else is it that we can be doing as a community. So as a new generation continues to learn and take action on issues related to human rights abuses in India, what are some ways archiving and connecting with organizers in Punjab may help with addressing memory preservation?
I think memory is critical. At Punjab, we often say that the battle for justice is often a battle for memory. And so what we have documented in Punjab is that individuals who were disappeared and unlawfully killed were almost always reported in the newspaper as a terrorist or a criminal who was killed in a shootout with security forces. So in terms of the public record, you have a total I would say, perversion of the actual truth. The only correlation to the truth is that perhaps the name of the victim is correct and perhaps the date of their murder or abduction is correct. But everything else is really something that subverts the truth. And so I think it's important. And one reason why we're making all of our documentation public is that we want everyone to be able to be equipped with the facts, where Ensaaf is not a bottleneck, where you don't need to rely on me or any other expert, that the data, the documentation is accessible and hopefully easily understandable, and so that we can rebut what the government of India and its supporters allege. And to be clear, we've released around 5,300 cases. This is not the totality of the victims. It's ultimately impossible to capture all the incidents from secondary sources such as newspaper records and court records and other human rights reports. We've kind of cataloged close to 25,000 violent deaths from that period of time. I would say the scale of torture is a magnitude greater. And so again, this is an undercounting. And so there's more documentation work to be done, and there's more kind of amplification of the information that is in the record. And related to that, I wouldn't say that we need to limit our voice to Punjab, whether we're seeing atrocities committed by Israel, whether we're seeing atrocities committed by security forces in Sudan, whether we're seeing human rights violations being committed by ICE here in the United States. These are all opportunities for us to kind of challenge, these individuals and these institutions that are committing, human rights violations. And it's important to exercise that voice. I truly believe the most fundamental defining aspect of what makes us human is our freedom, and especially our freedom to engage in expression and forms of speech, whether it's our voice, whether it's our writing, whether we use our bodies in other ways. And the less we exercise this, the more likely we are to lose our freedoms and human rights. And so I don't think you need to wait for some type of atrocity to be documented, or the next wave of atrocities from Punjab. There's no shortage, unfortunately, regrettably, of these types of transgressions happening locally within your community and around the world. And again, the Sikh ethos is that all humanity is one. We believe in Sarbat Tapala, and there's no distinction, from a Sikh perspective, between atrocities that happen to Sikhs and that happen to anyone else. And it's at our own peril. So even if you wanted to take a selfish perspective, it's at our own peril that we don't speak up. And there's so many maxims around this that I'm sure you're all familiar with, and there's so many examples that I could give you. And the idea that atrocities in India or Punjab will be limited there, or atrocities and genocide in Israel or Sudan will be limited to those contexts, is completely foolhardy. One kind of specific study that I would like to highlight that kind of illustrates these uh, the kind of fundamental insecurity that is caused globally when these abuses are not addressed is by the former Special Rapporteur Theo van Boven, um, former Special Rapporteur to the United Nations on the issue of torture. Theo van Boven did a study on the trade in instruments of torture. So there's a global trade on devices that are used to torture people. There's an economy around this. And so what he observed is when one repressive regime is able to uh, engage in torture in a systematic fashion, it catches the attention of other countries, and then they want to kind of purchase the same weapons or instruments that are used to torture people. And so when we don't speak up against this, it very well is a question of a matter of time before then these same types of technologies and instruments are going to be applied to us. And I don't mean to be alarmist, but there's just a lot of direct connections. We can't think like, oh, this is in some remote part of corner of the earth where rule of law doesn't exist, and therefore we don't have to be concerned. That's simply not the case. And I can give you example after example.
Yeah. Let me ask you before we close, just one piece of advice from you. I've often heard, and a lot of my friends have often heard that one of the most dangerous ways to engage in human rights work vis-a-vis Punjab is to sort of come in with a savior complex, and to do it from a distance without being sensitive to the potential repercussions or consequences for people who live there every day. And so a question for you, I mean, I know you've been sensitive about that throughout your career, and you're there on the ground regularly, you have a team there. But what advice would you give to people who may not know the full ground realities of what life is like in Punjab and how things work in Punjab, but actually do want to make a difference? Where should they start, or what should they be attending to?
Thank you for that question. I think it's very important. It is very problematic to kind of have these top-down attitudes, this attitude that I have some specialized training or qualifications, and therefore I know. I would say um, Ensaaf's role has always been to kind of work in partnership with defenders in India and Punjab and elsewhere, and to work in partnership with persecuted families. All of our kind of programs and projects directly have been informed by people who have been on the front lines of these struggles and movements. 100% of all of our projects are designed in partnership with these individuals, and they directly participate in these projects, and in many cases lead these projects. And had we not taken that approach, we would have certainly done more harm than good. And so I would say um, it's I think critical to kind of obtain the understanding from individuals who have experienced these human rights violations, from the advocates who have struggled through um, these cases and through the process of representing these issues. And in terms of how to kind of make sure that you have information, I would certainly encourage everyone to kind of follow Ensaaf, on social media, sign up for our email listserv, where all of our advocacy is evidence-based, and it's informed directly by the experiences of the survivors that we've documented. We rarely rely on kind of secondhand accounts. Part of our methodology is to obtain information as much as possible from survivors and witnesses and people who are actually working on these issues. And that's why we have a lot of confidence in our kind of factual analysis and legal analysis.
Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you for this time, and just to sort of amplify something you said there at the end. This work, I mean, it's a labor of love. It's not easy, but it's also not free. So if people are thinking about how to support, there is the kind of support where you engage with the work and become knowledgeable about these issues and help support in that way. And then there's also financial support, which helps pay the bills and get the work done. And so if you're willing, if you're interested, you can find Insaf online and offer your donation. And it's an organization that I have a lot of admiration for a long time doing important work. So thank you, Sukhman, for taking time just to sort of share with us. I know you have other big things to do, but it means a lot to just get some perspective on what you're doing and why and what the landscape is right now. So thanks a lot for your time.
Thank you so much for this conversation and your time. Yeah, and it's always a privilege to kind of learn from your expertise as well. So I really appreciate that. And also, again, thank you to the Sikh Foundation for, bringing us together and convening this conversation.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you everyone for joining.
Thank
Thanks
you.
again to the Sikh Foundation for
Thank you,
bringing.
everyone.
Yeah. Waheguru Ji Ka
Thank you,
Khalsa.
everyone. Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh.